Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 13th of August now. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest forecasts and weather situation for your community and village around Alaska by going to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. The phone works as well. 800-472-0391 will get you to the weather info line. You can find information throughout your day on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. In the afternoon, you'll get your daily afternoon map briefing. It's about 4 o'clock or so. If you go to the search bar on YouTube and type in AKWX or NWS Anchorage or NWS Fairbanks, you'll find that about 2.5-minute broadcast there with the maps and the audio to get you through. Or if you like, after this show, if you miss a piece of that and you'd really like to go back and say watch the aviation segment, you can do that fairly easily simply by going back to YouTube and typing AKWX TV for the full broadcast of Alaska weather, or go to our broadcast partner here at Alaska Public and you'll see that on the right-hand side of your screen if you scroll down just a bit. Tonight's hazardous weather includes a flood advisory that's going to take us into early parts of next week. Recent heavier rains there across the western Kenai Peninsula have allowed the Kenai River and the Kenai Lake to rise enough that those levels are going to come up and probably stay up for a while. So levels there for the Kenai River, Kenai Lake, and actually Tustamina Lake as well will be at a flood advisory level there until probably about Monday noon. So make sure you're keeping watch on that. And if you're normally affected by slightly higher levels along those waterways, you want to keep watch that if it starts to come up a little bit more, you're able to move whatever equipment or property that you have, or leave, of course, if you're affected even more. So again, a flood advisory there for the western Kenai Peninsula for areas specifically around the Kenai Lake, Kenai River, and Tustamina Lake. As we go out toward the larger state view here, the fire danger continues across some parts of the interior and even northwest. However, fire managers there are saying that areas on the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula now has lowered enough that we're not worried about that anymore in any large-scale fashion, probably for the rest of the season. So some improvements there, but we continue to watch some drier areas across the interior, north of the Alaska Range, and certainly to the west and northwest as well around Alaska. Always a good idea to be fire safe and careful. Here's a look at the infrared satellite picture now. This is going to pick up a lot more of what we see across the Arctic coastline. You'll notice a lot of low clouds there. Had some pretty gusty winds up around Dead Horse today and Prudhoe Bay. Some of those wind gusts, I believe, were over 30, maybe pushing 40 miles an hour for a time this afternoon. Also some gustier conditions out around Adak as the storm system is working just on the south side of the chain. The main focus for precipitation right now is this fire hose that's working its way across the eastern Gulf of Alaska, wrapping into low pressure here. Several waves of that have been working out of the Bering and into the north and western Gulf. The most recent here has brought some heavier rainfall to northern parts of Southeast and Prince William Sound, and it's going to stay in that kind of mode for several days. In fact, if you look at it the long term, it's not really out of the question that we could tap into what is Hurricane Julian, I believe. I got the name right there. That's north and west of Hawaii, and some of that moisture and maybe even some of that storm energy could be wrapped into another Gulf of Alaska kind of situation similar to this. But again, if it's got a lot of tropical moisture content in that, that could easily be brought into the Gulf of Alaska, probably in the northern areas. However, that is well into next week, so just keep an eye on that. And if you're in a region that has problems with some heavier rainfall in the North Gulf Coast, then that's something you want to keep watch on for sure. As you look out across the Bering, a lot of low clouds and fog across the southern Bering. You can see a very smooth nature to the picture taken from outer space. That's a pretty good sign that that is stratus cloud cover. Out to the west and south of Adak is our next wave of low pressure. It's working there toward Adak and probably responsible for those gusty winds. Out across south central Alaska, a lot of clouds bubbling up. This has more of a ripply or a bubble kind of shape to it. As we look again from outer space, that is probably convective weather, air that's moving upwards and pushing those clouds to bubble up. That usually brings a better chance for showers or more steadier rainfall in some cases there. If you look out here, some bright white tops around Nome and eastward into Norton Sound, and also around the Dillingham area and Bristol Bay. The chances are those are showers or thunderstorms, and we did see some lightning strikes on our monitors earlier today across western sections of Alaska. As we take a look at the satellite map there and put the surface features on top of that, and you see a 989 millibar low south of Alaska peninsula, spreading in some drier air westward slowly across the Gulf of Alaska. It's also pushing some warmer and wetter air slowly toward the northern coast. This is squeezing some wind right across the northern coast. We've seen some stronger wind gusts there, and we expect that to continue again tomorrow, probably making for a turbulent atmosphere if you're trying to fly through that, say from Prince William Sound out toward northern sections of southeast. Across the north, we see more snow cover across the hills than anything else. Also looking at low clouds across the Arctic coast, and again some gusty winds moving along the Arctic coastline itself around Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse especially. Low visibility has been an issue there today as well. To the west, a low pressure system is getting organized and spinning up into action here. It's only 997 millibars, but as we've already seen, there could be some stronger gusts across the central chain. Low pressure south of the Hitchinbrook entrance and also Montague Island, 1001 millibars, still allowing that higher moisture to work its way into the northern Gulf Coast from Yakutat all the way to Prince William Sound. Seas will remain high generally in the morning when you get started, but during the day there should be some pretty gradual improvement, especially for areas west of the low pressure system, and eventually by the late afternoon probably in the north as well. Showers will continue along the Yukon and also across Norton Sound and the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline. Look for a better chance for thunderstorms across Kotzebue Sound as we start the early evening hours, and then by tomorrow afternoon a better opportunity for that across the western Brooks Range, across the west coast by and large, and also across the Bristol Bay. Showers and thunderstorms will probably focus more on the west, but for the east it'll be more of a steadier rainfall, again from Prince William Sound to Yakutat and maybe some coastal areas of southeastern Alaska as that frontal boundary tries to wring out the range just a little bit more. Across the central Aleutians, a 992 millibar low is what we're looking at now, and as that passes over Adak and Atka, you'll see your winds switch throughout the day. Again, things settling down a little bit more by Friday than what you'll have on Thursday. For right now, it looks like by Thursday night we'll be dealing with some gales across the Pacific coastline areas of the central and western Aleutians, and then some improvements are expected perhaps as we get into Friday. By Friday afternoon, that storm is now a little bit closer to Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. It's 985 millibars, and the frontal boundary stretches well into the North Pacific. We'll catch a break in some of the precipitation that's been widespread across the Gulf, and you can see the moisture channel here across southeastern Alaska and the northern Gulf is being stretched out and kind of cut off a little bit more from that main feed that's well to the south. As we look a little bit farther north, there's still a widespread opportunity for showers across the interior, across the Brooks Range, and even some parts of the coastal plain. The main focus for showers and thunderstorms will likely be along that stationary boundary that's also located fairly close to the Brooks Range summits. Across the YK, we expect to see at least a chance for some light rain, maybe a little more showery in nature as the day goes on. And areas of fog should be fairly widespread from the Bering Strait and through the central and western Bering, probably close to the Pribilofs and generally north of the Aleutians as well. Looking at temperatures for the 4 o'clock hour this afternoon, we had readings all across the board for southeast today, up around Haines and Skagway. Temps were in the 50s and 60s, mid-50s for most of southeastern Alaska, with one exception. When you get down to southeast, temperatures cruised into the lower 70s for Hyder, and areas around Annette and Ketchikan were considerably warmer, at least for a little while this afternoon. Prince William Sound saw temperatures in the mid-70s there. Around Montague Island is 57. 55 in Seward, 68 in Homer with 61 in Kenai, a little breezy there at times. 58 degrees today around Anchorage and cooler thanks to the rain that fell. In some cases there, we saw about a third of an inch out across the airport. 59 in Talkeetna, 60s and 70s for a good part of the interior. Once you moved out of Healy and across the flatter terrain and down into the Tanana Valley, things were considerably warmer. 74 across Eagle, 65 in Northway, 61 in Fort Yukon. Northward around Ambler and Bettles, you saw temps nearing 70 degrees. That's about what we saw there around Galena today. 30s and 40s for a good part of the Arctic coast. 37 in Barrow, 49 for Wainwright. 60s for the northern side of the Kotzebue Sound region, including Kotzebue at 66. Shishmaref was 55. 68 in Nome. And most areas across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta were in the lower 60s. Even coastal areas were fairly warm today. St. Lawrence Island was about 48. Nunivak Island 61. Dillingham 59. King Salmon looking at 63. And most of the Alaska Peninsula, generally north and east of the Shumagan Islands, are in the lower 60s there, including Cold Bay and Falls Pass. And once you get out toward Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, temperatures there were about 60 degrees or so. Low 50s for the Pribilofs and low to mid 50s for the west and central part of the chain. Into low temperatures tonight, we're predicting most areas across the west coast in the lower to mid 50s. Nome about 54. Same goes for Dillingham. King Salmon could be a little bit cooler. Kodiak about 55. The interior close to the mid 50s as well, including Fort Yukon and Fairbanks. South Central looking at lower 50s. Southeast generally mid to upper 50s. They're a little bit closer to 60 as you head toward Annette and Ketchikan. For the central and western chain, some areas, even Attu, could go below that 50-degree mark tonight. 50 for St. Paul and St. George, 47 for St. Lawrence Island, and 30s and 40s for the Arctic coast. Looking at Thursday's high temperatures now for the Yukon Valley, generally upper 60s and lower 70s from the coast all the way out toward Eagle at 77, one of the hotter spots in the state tomorrow. Southeastern Alaska in the mid 60s to about 70 degrees. Of course, the warmest weather in the south. The coolest weather probably closer to Gustavus at 59. About the same there for Kodiak Island. South Central may warm up a little bit more tomorrow in the lower 60s. Prince William Sound closer to 60 degrees. The Arctic coast in the upper 40s to about 50 degrees as you head west of Wainwright. And the Kotzebue Sound temperatures could warm a little bit more into the mid to upper 60s there. Kivalina and Kotzebue probably some of the warmest. The Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline and Delta region in the mid to upper 60s. McGrath likely pushing the upper 60s there at times. And again, the Alaska Peninsula and the chain probably in the 50s and 60s tomorrow. So a little bit milder for many areas to the west as some of that rainfall breaks up just a bit. Flying weather, as you look at the northern Gulf Coast, we do expect continued IFR there, so this will not be one of the warmer places tomorrow. As that moisture stream continues into the Gulf, that is MVFR all the way out into the open water. South of Kodiak Island and up the YK coastline, MVFR conditions should prevail. Watch for convective weather, of course, across the higher terrain and some parts of the western interior. IFR conditions across the Arctic coast and a large part of the Bering, as well as the central Aleutians and the Pribilofs tomorrow afternoon. Here's your pass conditions now. We expect IFR generally north of the Brooks Range tomorrow. Most of the pass, though, should be VFR. Same goes for Adigan Pass. Again, you'll encounter much worse visibility north of the Brooks Range summits. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see improvements during the day, heading for VFR. Same goes for Rainy Pass. IFR to start your Thursday. Windy Pass, MVFR trending toward visual flight rule as the day goes on. MVFR conditions to start in Isabel Pass, and for Mentasta Pass, marginal conditions leaning over toward VFR through the day. Tanita Pass should be VFR by day's end, and through the late afternoon we expect to maintain IFR in Portage Pass with VFR on the western side, even out of the Turnagain Arm area. Things should be a lot better once you get through. Chilkoot and White Pass, we expect to see IFR trending toward MVFR conditions as you go through your Thursday. So again, some improvements there in the northern parts of southeast. You can see the freezing levels once again increasing from 10, 12, even 14,000 feet as you get south of Haida Gwaii. We've still got a pocket of cold air here across the western Gulf, very close to and right over that area of low pressure, of course. And then colder air dropping southward across the western Bering Sea. You can see the tight packing of the temperature contours, though, pretty close to the Aleutians, and cooler air there across the northern Arctic coast as well. Icing potential above 10,000 feet. We had several of you reporting ice, or at least some light to moderate rime today across south central and I believe across southwest. So keep those pilot reports coming. They help improve our forecast and help us make sure that we know where the worst icing is so we can communicate that to the rest of the pilot community in Alaska. So we really do appreciate those pilot reports. Once again, light to isolated moderate generally across the northern parts of southeast, the northern Gulf Coast, and into south central. Parts of the Talkeetnas and the Alaska Range should experience at least a little bit of that tomorrow. Above 8,000 feet across the northwestern coast, across the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, and the central and western part of the chain generally above 10,000 feet. So it's pretty high up there, but again, there will be some icing potential tomorrow. As far as the jet stream goes, the controlling factor in our weather is this broad trough of low pressure that extends into the northern Pacific. Another wave of low pressure across the Pacific Northwest is helping to move this along just a little bit there. So as this wave moves slightly eastward, we'll start to develop the next surge of that's already moving south of the Kamchatka Peninsula tonight. The strongest winds there just south of the chain are running about 120 knots. 9,000 feet. Our broad southerly flow across the Gulf of Alaska is not a stranger to the region at all, especially if you're in the northern Gulf Coast. You know this opens the door to precipitation, and we stay in this pattern for the next several days. A southerly flow coming into Kodiak Island, south central and southeastern Alaska between 20 and 50 knots is strong enough to keep that wet weather pattern in place. Out across the western part of Alaska, winds are a little bit lighter from the south and east coming over the mountains there. They're drying up, but it's still supporting some gusty conditions there up across the Arctic coast, especially at the surface. Low pressure also moving through the central chain between 40 and 50 knots on the south side and 20 to 25 knots on the north side. Pribilof Islands right now looking at a southeast wind above about 10 knots. That drops to about 5 knots as you get down to 3,000 feet. There's our southerly flow again crossing the Gulf, so ample room for moisture conveyance there, and a south and easterly flow running more parallel to the Arctic coast, in this case at 3,000 feet, with a 20-knot flow again from east to west, and more of a northerly flow coming into Attu, and southeasterly winds reaching southeastern Alaska. Winds are light across the interior. For turbulence then, below 4,000 feet for the Arctic coast, most of that should be light to isolated moderate. We expect similar conditions across the central chain, with one exception though. We did have some gusty winds that we talked about in Adak, and below 6,000 feet you might run into occasional to widespread moderate also along that leading edge of the frontal boundary moving across the Gulf. Light to isolated moderate chop should be found across Prince William Sound communities and into Yakutat, and maybe stopping just north of Sitka. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with an Ice Edge update and of course your marine weather forecast. Stay tuned.
Atmospheric researchers have confirmed that the Arctic haze, a polluted air mass that forms each winter over the Arctic region, is widespread and deep, increasing scientific interest about its effect upon the climate. In 1983, scientists aboard a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration research aircraft took airborne samples of the haze. From the atmosphere above the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. And over Barrow, Alaska. Flying through the haze at altitudes from 50 to 28,000 feet, the researchers analyzed the chemical structure of samples collected by instruments on the plane. A preliminary air sample analysis by Dr. R.A. Rasmussen of Oregon Graduate Center indicates the haze largely is composed of a chemical compound, PCE, and hydrocarbons from fossil fuel combustion. This tends to substantiate the theory that the haze is caused by atmospheric pollutants being carried into the Arctic from principally Europe and northern Asia.
12. CN dropping off. We just passed through an incredibly thick layer, went off scale on the ethylometer. It also is dropping off now on the NEF. Now we're coming back into, look at it, we're coming into another layer. And you'll be picking it up in a minute. I'll pick it up in 1 minute. Yeah. So we're coming, the CN is coming in. It's just as good as the other one. Look at it. The NEF is starting to pick it up.
Well, this is our trace here. This was the previous layer.
Fantastic. Oh, no, just a thin one. It's falling off again. See?
I went completely off scale.
Good. See, that's fantastic. No, this is just a little patch. See it fall off again?
Okay, now.
Went through a clean area, now we're coming back into another patch. You'll be picking it up shortly. Well, the NEF is coming up again, too. See, it's really patchy.
There we are.
There, see? Oh, look at it. Look at it climb.
Yeah.
Hey, fantastic.
We had a rather diffuse layer very strong concentration. Here we saw a rather stronger layer. I was then able to reduce the resolution time of the instrument, and then here we saw an incredibly thick layer, back down to nothing down there. Oh, gee. Hey, hold it. That's 8, 10, 11. 11 counts. Here we are now in another very strong layer here, and I hope if my instrument goes off scale again,
Hey, the nest is climbing higher than it's ever been now.
Just whacked off scale again.
Yeah, I know. Pretty low already. We're at 100 meters.
We're going to go lower.
Time 23:47. We're holding in the haze now at 952 meters. We passed through descending at about 3 minutes ago, and now we're back up into it, holding steady right in the center of the haze.
This filter is so-called millipore filter. All of the air was restricted to go through the center by means of the plastic mask. You can see the black spot in the center is the deposit of particles. We can analyze these by a variety of chemical and physical means to study the carbon, both the black carbon and also any organic type of carbon.
Heading the score of scientists on the NOAA study is Dr. Russell Schnell.
We found the haze layers to be more numerous than anticipated, and the intensity of the pollution exceedingly larger than anyone had expected. And finally, the pollution was spread over much larger areas than we had originally thought.
Flight data will be used in developing improved climate models for determining the effect of the haze on the Arctic climate.
I'm not sure how they got that camera shot there because there is no room on those airplanes with all the equipment there. That being said, here's a look at today's sea ice edge. You'll notice this little sliver of ice snaking right along the Beaufort seacoast. It is still affecting traffic into some of the ports as far as we know. The general flow is from the east across the Beaufort Sea, and we can see that some of the concentrations of ice here are a little bit in question there. So if you're going out thinking there's a ton of open water, there may still be some chunks of ice that are present that may not have been analyzed quite well. Basically, confidence is a little bit lower than normal because of the lack of really good satellite visibility right now in this area. But with that said, you can always get the very latest sea ice edge anytime you want at weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. And you can make maps like this for whatever village you're looking from, or if that's just your personal interest. All that information should be there, as well as the outlooks that take us well beyond today. Thursday's marine forecast in southeast keeps winds pretty light across the inner waterways, about 10 to 15 knots or so, 2 to 3 foot seas across the region from the Lynn Canal all the way down to the Clarence Strait. Coastal winds be a little bit stronger. We expect those to be as high as 9 to 11 feet and increasing throughout the day. Outside of Gustavus, southeasterly wind there at 30 knots with a 9 to 11 foot sea, otherwise 20 to 25 knots coming up the coastline. That diminishes somewhat on Friday in a few areas outside of Yakutat. A southerly wind at 15 knots with an 8 foot sea. Westerlies coming into the Dixon entrance at 15 knots with a 9 foot sea. We're still going to have some stronger winds though across the northern coastal areas with an 11 foot sea as winds come in from the southeast at 25 knots. Inner waterways still looking at 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas to wrap up the week. Across South Central, do expect higher gusts, especially outside and in the Hitchinbrook entrance area. An easterly flow inside of Prince William Sound should be better than today with a 2 foot sea by the afternoon. Southeasterly winds outside of Prince William Sound at 30 knots with a 9 foot sea. And winds will be changing direction across the western Gulf here as that frontal boundary works through. So watch for some of that to switch a little bit during the day. More of a 20 knot wind there with 7 to 8 foot seas south of the Kenai Peninsula. A variable flow on either side of Kodiak Island becoming northeasterly throughout the day, and northerlies coming down the Cook Inlet. 25 knots with a 5 to 6 foot sea, and you can see winds diminish in all areas as we get into Friday. Easterlies inside and more of a southeasterly flow outside of Prince William Sound. 2 to 7 foot seas there, 6 foot seas in the western Gulf and around the Barrens. More of a variable flow there with a light easterly flow south of Kenai and north of Homer. Across the Alaska Peninsula, light winds will rule the day for Thursday across the Bering Sea coast there. 10-knot variable wind across the southern regions, more of a southeasterly flow inside of Bristol Bay, and 15-knot winds there south of the peninsula in the Pacific waters with 7 to 8 foot seas. That becomes more of a south and southeasterly flow across the entire region as we go into Friday. Southeasterlies at 15 knots inside of Bristol Bay, up to 25 knots the further down the coast you go on the Bering Sea coast. South and southeasterly wind there as well for the Pacific at 15 to 20 knots. Across the Aleutians, we'll see the strongest winds generally west of Atka at 20 to 25 knots. South of the chain, 25-knot winds there from the south and east with a 7-foot sea. Northerly winds out around Attu and more northeasterly winds for Kiska, both at 7 feet. A northwesterly flow for Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. And Nikolsky looking at more of a southerly flow on your end of the islands. Looks like 15 to 20 knots with a 5 to 6 foot sea there. Winds are going to strengthen once again as we get into Thursday night, where gales become possible south of the chain and around Adak and Atka in the Bering Sea region. Look for a northeasterly flow there as you get out toward Nikolsky and Atka. More of a southwesterly flow south of the chain, and as you would expect, low pressure is going to be right about here. So expect some of your stronger winds there, especially on the western side. Across the west coast, northerly flow should be pretty light, about 10 to 15 knots, 5-foot seas around the Pribilofs, 4-foot seas around St. Matthew, and a variable flow for the Kuskokwim Delta becoming southeasterly by Friday. Winds will pick up for the Pribilofs up to 20 knots from the northeast, and a weak southerly flow coming into the St. Lawrence Island and Bering Sea coast region with a 2-foot sea there. Across the Arctic coast, a broad easterly flow sweeping across the region, 25 to 30 knots, 6 to 7 foot seas across the Chukchi Sea, 5 to 6 foot seas in the Beaufort. And as we get into Friday, the winds don't change a whole lot, generally from the east, 30 knots from Barrow to Kaktovik with an 8-foot sea there. The Chukchi Sea coast, easterlies 20 to 25 knots, and in the Kotzebue Sound region, winds diminish to 10 knots with a 3-foot sea. A quick recap shows rain is still likely for the northern Gulf Coast, with a few showers and storms increasing again tomorrow in the north and west along a frontal boundary in the south and west. By Friday, more rain focuses in the west. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.